Hello and welcome to this PowerPoint in which I'll be taking you through ACs 1.2 and 3.1 on the court system and the judiciary. So let's start with just an overview. His Majesty's Courts and Tribunal Service is the administrative unit that is responsible for all of criminal, civil and family courts and tribunals in England and Wales. So the Courts and Tribunal Service has overall control of everything that happens in the court system in this country. And we've got two court systems in the UK. We've got the civil court system and we've got the criminal court system. Now you need to be aware of both, but in reality for the exam we'll mainly be looking at the criminal court system. So it's just worth remembering that when we look at the civil courts, they deal with civil disputes, so that's stuff that involves private disputes between people or businesses, disputes over property, contracts, personal injury claims, that sort of thing. And what's usually happening there is the claimant wants some sort of remedy, damages, that sort of thing. Whereas if we're talking about criminal courts, they're dealing with cases where someone has committed a criminal offence. They've committed a crime such as theft, murder, armed robbery, rape, whatever. If found guilty, then the defendant will be punished. They'll receive a formal sanction. So that's the difference between the two main court systems in this country. Now, when we get down to the criminal court system, we've got two criminal courts of the first instance. Now, what do we mean by the phrase first instance? Well, this means that all criminal cases will have their first trial, and I mean trial here, in either, and it's the Magistrates Court or it's the Crown Court. And that depends very much on how severe the offence is. Because there are three categories of criminal offence, and you absolutely have to need to know these for the exam. So the three categories are, you've got summary offences, and these are the least serious offences, so such as speeding, assault, not paying your TV licence, and summary offences are tried in a magistrates court, so they're heard in a magistrates court. Secondly, you've got triable either way offences. Now they're mid-level offences such as ABH, theft, that sort of thing. And they can be tried in a magistrates court, but also they can be tried in a Crown Court. And that very much depends on the plea of the defendant and the sentence that would need to be imposed. I'm going to explain this in a bit more detail a little later on. What I should say is everyone has the right to be heard in a Crown Court. So it is possible, if you really want to be very bloody minded, that you could take your speeding ticket or your speeding fine in a magistrates court and you could demand to be heard in a Crown Court. The reality is, as you'll find out later on, is that magistrates courts can only impose a certain length of sentence, whereas Crown Courts could go a lot higher. So you take a risk by going to a Crown Court. A, it's more expensive, and B, the sentences are longer. And your third type of offence is your indictable offence, and these are the most serious offences: rape, murder, etc. And they can only be tried in a Crown Court. Now there are also there's a youth court division of the Magistrates Court, and that deals with cases where someone is the accused is between 10 and 18. Although if it's a really severe case, it will go to the Crown Court. So let's dig a little deeper. There's Plymouth Magistrates Court. All cases originally start off in the Magistrates Court. Now what I mean by that is whoever's been charged by the police will come up in front of the Magistrates Courts first. And what they're really doing is they're triaging there. And they're thinking as they have the offended in front of them, well, is this a summary offence? If it is a summary offence, then we'll carry on. We'll hear the case then and now, or we'll set a date for the case. We'll hear it in a magistrates court because it's only a minor summary offence. Or they might be thinking, well, is this a triable either way offence? If it is, For instance, is the defendant likely to plead not guilty? If he is, then, or she is, then they're likely to have a slightly lower sentence. So that might fit in with a magistrates court hearing. Whereas if they are going to plead not guilty, maybe the sentence might be a little longer if they're found guilty, so it needs to go to a Crown Court. So they're assessing, they're triaging where the case will go, and a date will be set at the Magistrates Court for whether the defendant will be at the Crown Court or at the Magistrates Court. And of course, if it's an indictable offence, it will just be shoved straight up to the Crown Court. So it starts off in a Magistrates Court, but then the trial, the first instance when it actually properly comes to trial, that is either the Magistrates Court or the Crown Court, depending on the severity of the offence. Hopefully that makes sense. So to sum it up, this is basically how it works. We start off in the Magistrates Courts, okay, and that deals with summary offences. If it's an indictable offence, if you need a trial by jury, then up to the Crown Court it goes. Okay. Now, you can, if there's an appeal from a Magistrates Court, if someone thinks the magistrates haven't given a correct appeal, that goes to the High Court, which hears appeals from the Magistrates Court. If it's a Crown Court and you want an appeal, it goes to the Court of Appeal and then up to the Supreme Court. If you want to appeal a High Court decision, having gone from Magistrates Court, that then goes up to the Supreme Court. So that is the legal process within this country. So have a look at that in more detail, get your head around it. It's pretty straightforward, but we'll dig a little deeper as we go on. So, who are your magistrates? Well, they're lay people. Now, this phrase comes up a lot. I'm going to give you a definition at the end of this slide. But a layperson is basically a non-professional. So magistrates they're not legal professionals. They sit as a magistrate on a voluntary basis. It's a minimum of 26 half days per year. And the other name for magistrates are also known sometimes as Justices of the Peace, JPs. And the Magistrates Court is a key part of our criminal justice system, because the reality is that 95% of cases are completed there. So they're heard in a Magistrates Court. And they also deal with many civil cases such as antisocial behaviour, public health, and they're responsible for the enforcement of things like fines and community punishments. But where cases require a greater penalty than the magistrate's sentencing powers, then they're shifted up to the Crown Court. Because magistrates, you absolutely have to know this, which is why it's in yellow, magistrates can only sentence up to 6 months imprisonment. So the maximum sentence a magistrate's court can give you is 6 months, unless you've committed 2 or more offences, in which case the maximum is 12 months. And when it comes to fines, now be really careful here because some textbooks are out of date and it has changed. It used to be they could only fine up to a maximum, I think it was of £10,000, but now actually they have no limit on the fines that they can impose. So that's changed very recently and some of the textbooks are out of date. So take that on board. So here's my definition of a layperson, just to help you, because there's quite often questions about the use of lay people in courts. A layperson is someone who's not trained, qualified or experienced in a particular subject or activity. So you can assume that magistrates have no legal qualifications whatsoever, even though they are working in the legal system, in the court system. So let's have a look at a magistrate's court. Now, if you're watching this on YouTube, there's a really good clip here which just introduces all the main people in a magistrate's court, but for the purpose of this, I'm going to take you through it bit by bit. So we start with our magistrates. In general, you're going to have 3 magistrates. There's usually 3 magistrates, hence the word tribunal. It's a tribunal form of justice. There are 3 people, tri meaning 3. They're lay people, and the magistrates listen to the case and they decide whether the defendant is guilty or innocent. And they then sentence the defendant if they have decided that they are guilty. Now, in reality, you have 3, an uneven number, because what you want is a decision. So that way there's always going to be a decision made one way or the other as to the guilt or innocence of people. So that's the magistrates. We've got our prosecutor advocate, our prosecutor solicitor, and they'll be employed by the Crown Prosecution Service. They're a professional solicitor who brings the case against the defendant who's sitting there in the dock. We've then got our defence advocate that will be employed by the defendant, and again that's another professional solicitor who will defend the accused. Our court clerk is the professional legal expert, so not a lay member but actually a professional legal expert who ensures that the case is conducted fairly and advises the magistrates on points of law. Because remember, the magistrates are not professionals, so therefore if they've got a question about a point of law, they will defer to the court clerk. Then we've got our usher down here, another lay person who's employed by the court just to escort witnesses, etc., in and out of the court, so pretty straightforward. And then finally, you'll have the probation officer, probation officers often attend court to give reports on the defendant prior to sentencing, and that report then informs the magistrate's sentencing decision. And you've also got other people like the press who will all be there, and the public as well, because anyone can attend a court in this country. You have a public gallery, you have the right to go and watch a Crown Court case and a Magistrates Court case. Just turn up and watch. That's what I would advise you to do if you're studying criminology. Go and see some cases. It's free. So now we come to the Crown Court. Very much the same as the Magistrates Court, with just a couple of differences. The main difference is being you've got this guy here or this woman here, the judge, and you've got the jury sitting over here. So the role of the judge is to maintain and manage the trial, to ensure fairness to all parties within the trial, to explain legal issues and procedures to members of the jury, to sum up evidence, and then to pass sentence if the jury find the defendant guilty. And there's your defendant in the dock, and there are your 12 jurors. Now, common mistake made by lots of students: in a Crown Court, the judge does not decide on the guilt of the defendant. It is the jury. The judge gives the sentence once someone has been found guilty. So that leads us on to the jury. That's made up of lay people. Anyone over the age of 18 can be called up for jury service, and the jury listen to the evidence and then decide on the guilt or innocence of the defendant. And the reason you've got 12 people on a jury, and you might ask, why have you got an even number? Surely you want an odd number so you don't get a split decision. And it's purely because our country is based in Christianity, and Jesus had 12 disciples. That is the only reason. So there you go. So other than that, prosecution lawyer, defence lawyer are all very much the same. The court officer is the same as the usher. There's no real difference here. The press are still there. The public gallery is still there. Nothing has really changed other than the fact that the judge is now there and the jury is there. So hopefully that makes sense. Crown Court, which leads me on to this discussion about the use of lay people in the court system. Quite often you'll get a question looking at the strengths and weaknesses of this. So what I've done is I've gone through the magistrates courts and just going to give you a few strengths and weaknesses as to what's good about having lay people in a magistrates court and what's good about having lay people in a Crown Court. So we start with the magistrates. The first thing you can argue, a real positive, is because they're volunteers, they don't cost the taxpayer much money, which is a really good thing when you consider that 95% of cases are heard by magistrates. And a little bit of research, the cost to replace magistrates with district judges, which would be a qualified legal professional, is in the region of about £100 million, maybe even more. So they save us a lot of money. Also, there's very few appeals from magistrates courts, so very few people appeal decisions by magistrates, which would suggest that the court is performing well in practice. You could also argue that because magistrates will be local people, they'll have local knowledge of the problems that face defendants and might be more sympathetic. And you could also say that even though they are legal professionals, they do have to undertake training and they are assisted by a legally qualified clerk. And finally, and this is really important, is cases are dealt with very quickly and people move through the justice system quickly. Cases come to an end, the decision is made, the sentence is given, it's all sorted, whereas Crown Court cases can drag on for many, many months. However, there are some downsides. So one of the downsides you could look at is the social background of the majority of magistrates isn't a true cross-section of society, because magistrates are predominantly middle class. They tend to be middle to old aged, and that's due to the fact that the role suits people who are retired, who are owners of companies, so can take more time off work, so they've got less work commitments. So many people argue it's not a true reflection of society. You don't have many 21-year-olds who are magistrates, and you are entitled to be a magistrate at the age of 21, because most people are working. And of course, if you have got to do 23 half days a year, not all employers are happy about giving you that time off. Secondly, because of this age gap, class issue, if you want to say, want to use that phrase, magistrates are often criticised as being out of touch with the vast majority of defendants, who tend to be from the lower classes, the working class of society. And a common criticism of magistrates is that they become case hardened. They get so used to seeing the run-of-the-mill stuff that comes through, they become hardened and oblivious to it, and then become unsympathetic to the people in front of them. And then there's also some evidence of inconsistency in sentencing amongst magistrates. So this then makes sentencing a bit of a geographical lottery. Depending on which part of the country in which magistrates you get will depend on what sentence you get for a specific crime, and it may be a slightly different sentence in another area, and that doesn't give us fairness and parity. Justice should be equally applied to all. So that's another criticism of magistrates. If we then look at the role of juries, let's look at the positives. Well, one of the things about having lay people involved in the justice system gives the public confidence in it, because we're involved in it. It's not being decided by the people that make the laws, the people that enforce the laws. It's your peers, your members of society that decide whether you are guilty or not, having heard the evidence. And because you have a random selection of jurors, that should ensure a good cross-section of society, which then promotes a lack of bias and promotes neutrality in theory. So that's a good thing. And of course the jury is completely independent, so therefore can't be pressurised by a judge to return a guilty verdict. And also, because juries make their decision in private, they're therefore not pressurised by outside influences. So again, that's another good thing that we could perhaps think about when we're thinking about the use of lay people in our court system. However, as with all these things, there are negatives. So first negative, you could say, you are taking anyone within society, and that does mean you are going to get a few marginally less intelligent people on a jury. So some people argue that a lack of intelligence, an inability to understand the evidence for some jurors, can often lead to slow and expensive trials, because jurors have to repeatedly have stuff explained to them, points of law explained to them. So if you haven't got it up here, you're going to struggle in a complex case. And another issue that we found that's been charged against jurors is that they are often found increasingly to be conducting research into the case, the defendant, using internet or social media. They're not supposed to, but they do. And this means you would argue they are no longer neutral because they're being influenced by social media, etc. And you can then look at acquittal rates. So if we go to a Crown Court, not guilty verdicts, acquittal rates are much higher in a Crown Court than in a Magistrates Court. Now, some people have suggested that's down to the fact that juries make perverse or irrational verdicts. And if they're making perverse and irrational verdicts, that means that justice is becoming haphazard, which is not a good thing. So some things to consider there about the use of lay people within our justice system. There's quite often a question about it in the exam, so know those strengths and weaknesses of both and you'll be fine. Right, let's move on to the last part of this presentation, which is on the judiciary. Who are the judiciary? Well, it's all the judges in the country's courts. We've got over 3,000 court judges in this country. And basically, the philosophy of the judiciary is summed up in the 6 principles which are written in the Guide to Judicial Conduct, which was published in 2016. And this is pretty self-obvious. So the first principle is that judges have got to be independent. So they've got to be independent and free from government interference in their decisions. So they've got to be impartial. So independent and impartial, so they mustn't show favour to one side or the other. They've got to have integrity, they've got to be honest, they've got to have strong moral principles. They've got to have propriety, which means they've got to uphold the accepted standards of behaviour and morals of our society. They've got to ensure equal treatment to everyone who comes before the court, so that there's not allowed to be any bias there. And they've got to be competent. They've got to have the knowledge and ability to do the job. That's fairly straightforward, you would think. Now, when it comes down to funding, obviously because they're civil servants, they're paid by taxes. But some people often think, well, you know, they've got a job for life. They can't be sacked, or it's very hard for them to be sacked. How much do they earn? Well, the pay of the judiciary is based on the advice of an independent body, and that's the independent body that also makes recommendations to the Prime Minister or the Lord Chancellor on how much judges should be paid, along with MPs and other senior civil servants. Now, in 2021, the most senior judge, the Lord Chief Justice, his salary was just over £250,000. And district judges, which is the lowest rank of judge, they earn 6 figures. It's £114,793, probably a bit more this year. Now, you might argue that is incredibly highly paid, but at the same time, you could also argue, well, that seems a lot, but judges are trained legal professionals. So they were all originally lawyers, barristers, solicitors, etc. Many lawyers earn far more than £250,000 a year, many. So what that actually means is that highly qualified lawyers are less likely to become judges because the money is higher elsewhere. So that is perhaps a weakness of our judicial system, because it could be argued that a salary of £250,000 could be a disincentive for some people to become judges. You make of that what you will. So that leads us to our final slide. How does the court system, how does the judiciary link in with other agencies of the criminal justice system? Well, if we're talking about the police are often prosecution witnesses in court, and they also transport defendants to and from court. If we're talking about the Crown Prosecution Service, well, the Crown Prosecution Service prepare and present the prosecution case against offenders in court. The Probation Service will prepare pre-sentencing reports on offenders, which they'll deliver in court. They'll supervise offenders that have been given community sentences by the court, and they'll supervise things such like drug testing if the court orders a drug test to be made. And then finally, we've got our prison service, who will carry out the custodial sentences that the court imposes on offenders. They also will supervise defendants who've been remanded into custody by the court, and they'll facilitate visits for defence lawyers to their clients in prison. So that's how the court system works with the other agencies of the criminal justice system. I hope you found that informative. We will revisit some of this stuff a little later on in some later PowerPoints, but until then, goodbye. I hope you've enjoyed it.